Appreciate your making this accommodation to be here and allow me to do it this way. Perhaps it will be most enjoyable. I'm going to be moving back and forth between my computer and here talking to you. I have a couple of, as I sometimes do, graphs to show you to illustrate some points. There is no place for me to project from my computer, so I'm going to have to get my laptop and kind of walk it towards you in order to make the points that I want to make. Okay, so today I'm going to be about public opinion towards leaders and institutions and the federal government in the United States. And so there's basically two things I'm going to talk about. One of them is trust in government and trust in fellow Americans. And the other part is presidential approval. So we're looking at public opinion towards the leader of the United States. Presidential approval is a topic that has received a lot of coverage for a long time, certainly received coverage since the advent of polls. You might remember from the beginning of the course that public opinion polling was done by a fellow named George Gallup. And one of the ways they kind of made their name was to do polling on the level of approval that presidents have. So there's actually an incredible data source going back all the way, at least to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on the level of approval that Americans have for the President of the United States. So we want to look at things like, first of all, we want to talk about why this matters. And who cares what presidential approval is? It does have some significant consequences. It's not everything, for sure. I'm going to talk about some patterns in presidential approval, particularly how it varies over time, both for presidents within their time in office as well as across presidencies. So some of the ways that presidential approval fluctuates today is not the same as how it would fluctuate even just 20 years ago, mostly due to the intense partisanship that the country is in. And we'll also, of course, take a little bit of a look at the approval rates for President Trump. Again, there's a very, very rich data source for looking at presidential approval. Okay. So let me talk about why presidential approval is worth looking at. For one thing, it can be a resource for presidents. So presidents who are very popular can persuade some members of the public to not only to support their policies and to pressure members of Congress to support their policies. And so it's a valuable resource to have. It also affects presidential governing, that is how presidents operate when they're in office. When presidents have low rates of approval, what they try to do is they try to find bills that are going to receive more public support. And to support bills, excuse me, that have more public support. And they're probably then going to shy away from bills that are popular within their party, but not popular within the broader public. On the other hand, if a president is really popular, he can focus on his own party's agenda and try to pass those bills that are really important to his party. So you might see a president, let's say a Democrat in office, with a high rate of approval, pushing health care. And if they don't have a high rate of approval, they may not be pushing health care. Or you may see a Republican president in office with a high rate of approval, pushing for some tax reductions. So it influences the way that they govern. It influences the bills that they're likely to support. It also means, again, that when presidents are really popular, they can probably go out there and get some support from the general public and get those people in the public to pressure their representatives or senators to vote for them on particular bills. So let me kind of first sort of talk about how that might happen with a story, probably the most famous story for this occurring. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States. Ronald Reagan ran on a pretty conservative platform, particularly for that time, although at this time, it probably doesn't seem quite as conservative as it did back then. But he won. He won election overwhelmingly in 1980, defeating Jimmy Carter by a large margin. I think Jimmy Carter carried the District of Columbia, Massachusetts, and Georgia, his home state. Ronald Reagan won all the rest of the states. And he was a pretty conservative Republican, again, for that time. And then he was inaugurated, Reagan was, in January of 1981. And then in March in 1981, he was going to give a talk, and had given a talk at an event at the what's called the Capitol Hilton, which is a couple blocks north of DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. As he was leaving the building, a man named John Hinckley, with a number of mental issues, was in the area outside where Reagan came to go from the building into the presidential limousine, and Hinckley shot Reagan. He also shot Jim Brady, who was Reagan's press secretary and also a Secret Service agent there. So that event occurred, and you can imagine it got a tremendous amount of media attention. Reagan went to the hospital. The Secret Service acted very quickly and appropriately. I mean, if you saw the footage, which I'm sure you could see on YouTube, you know, they like pushed Reagan into the car, shut the door, and took off for George Washington Hospital. Reagan underwent a couple of operations to remove the bullet, okay, that had lodged within him. Hinckley had done this in order to impress, believe it or not, the actress Jodie Foster. So he you know, was not playing with a full deck, to be sure. One thing that happened was Reagan's level of popularity went up. And so Reagan got shot, and more people approved of the job he was doing. And so really, you know, it wasn't necessarily the case that people thought he was doing a good job there as a result of being shot, but it was probably the case that there was this outpouring of sympathy. And Reagan people were very clever in how they used this. So he was shot, and the first public appearance that he made, something like 6 weeks after being shot, was an address to the nation to encourage citizens to call or contact or send a letter to the representatives or senators to support the budget and tax bills that he had sent to Capitol Hill. And there really was just an outpouring of support for him. So there was not only support for Reagan the person, and again, probably a great deal of it sympathetic, but also then for his policies. And he was able to translate his popularity. His popularity had gone up 15 points after being shot, and it led to the public supporting his policies. So, and that's a way that presidential approval can be a resource. We also know that the outcomes of midterm elections are affected by presidential approval. So when presidential approval is high, presidents lose their party loses few seats at the midterm election. So if there is this pattern in American politics where the party controlling the White House always loses seats at the midterm. Hasn't happened always, but almost has happened always. Since 1932, the only two times that it has not happened is 1998 and 2002. And those cases are also illustrating the point that I'm about to make. And so when the president's approval rating is low, they tend to lose a lot of seats. So it's not the only thing that determines the amount of seats that they lose, but presidential approval is one of the factors. And so in 2018, the Republicans lost a lot of seats in the House of Representatives, something like, I don't know, 50, 60 seats. And the Democrats won, actually, it was a little over 30 seats that the Republicans lost, but it was enough for the Democrats to take control of the House of Representatives. So that's also obviously a big problem for Republicans. They lose control of the House of Representatives as a result of there being low level of approval for President Trump. In 1998, the Democrats actually gained, I think it was 6 seats in the 1998 midterm elections. And so that was really unusual. I mean, that had not happened since 1932, okay? So that actually strengthened the Democrats in the House of Representatives and made their lead stronger. And the reasons that they probably gained seats were Clinton's high level of approval. His level of approval was something around 66, 67% of the population thought he was doing a pretty good job. And there was also kind of a turning against the Republican Party for making an issue of the Monica Lewinsky affair by trying to impeach Clinton. But it made the Democrats' hand so much stronger in governing at that time that they were really able to get a lot of what they wanted in the ensuing budgets. So presidential approval is a resource. It's politically powerful. It can be translated into support in Congress. It can allow members to survive in Congress. Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives, but when it went to the Senate, they said they did not want to see him removed from office. Now, maybe if his approval rating had been lower, perhaps he would have been removed from office. Richard Nixon was not impeached in 1974. He chose to resign. But Nixon had, by that point, very low levels of approval. Somewhere around 25% of the public approved of the job that he was doing. So approximately 75% disapproved of the job that he was doing. And perhaps if Nixon had had high levels of approval, he would not have had to resign from office. But he did, so that was certainly consequential for him. So those are a number of ways in which presidential approval is very important for presidents and for reasons that they care about it. Now, what I want to do is show you patterns of approval for some presidents. So given what I got here, what I'm going to have to do is bring this up on my laptop like that, and then I'm going to walk this close to you. So this here is Trump's level of approval, and I'm looking at the monitor to see what you see. Okay, doesn't quite react as quickly, so it throws me off a little bit. So this goes actually from January of 2017 up until just April, and this is from Gallup, and this is actually on Wikipedia. And so one thing you can certainly see there is that Trump's approval rating is very, it's both low and flat. You can see there's some peaks and valleys. It's actually gone up. You can see recently that it's gone up in April. And if you, let me see, I guess it's over here. This is weird. Towards the end, you can see it's kind of gone up in April there. It's kind of weird looking at the monitor here. It's not in real time. There's like a couple second delay to it. So this is over here April, and what I'm guessing now is that there's been kind of a boost with the Mueller report, but Trump's approval ratings have generally been somewhere between 36, and actually now is at one of his highest points, close to 50%. Now let me show you another president. So this here is George W. Bush. The green means approval, the red means disapproval, and the yellow is for those people who had no opinion. And so you could see that Bush started with approval basically around 60%. So he started off in a pretty good place, and then you could see that at one point it shot up quite a bit there, and then it started to go down throughout the rest of his two terms, and he did end on a low note. You could see that upward trajectory. Let me see if there's another way I can do this to get it here. So right here you could see it going up. You could also see an upsurge here, and an upsurge here, and then a decline there. So his high point was over 90%. So that peak up here is over 90% of the public approving of the job that he's doing. And even here, let me see if I can get that right there. The approval here is over 70%, which is pretty good. So you see there's a lot more variation that occurred over time in the George W. Bush presidency. So they compared to Trump. So let me show you another one too, and then we want to talk about those rises and falls. Let me go even further back in time. Let me see. This is Nixon's level of approval. And you could see he also starts off fairly high, that approval rating being around 60%. It does go a little bit below that. It has this period here where it goes up a bit and then goes crashing down and ending there in 1974. Again, with probably something like 25–26% of the public approving of the job that he is doing, and probably, again, somewhere over 60% of the public disapproving. So that's interesting, and I'm going to go further back in time if I can. And this is Dwight Eisenhower's approval rating. So this is from the 1950s. And kind of one of the things that's most striking to me here is the very high rates of approval. So if you recall again, Trump's level of approval is generally hovering around 40%, a few times getting above it, a couple times going below it. But you know, the lowest that Eisenhower gets is to 50% here and here, and those are his lowest. And a lot of times he's easily above 60%. You can see some variation over time, you know, that it tends to go up and down. So actually, one of the other things that's most striking to me is that you do get that kind of variation over time, with it being, you know, something probably moving it up and something probably moving it down. Let me see if there's any other folks I want to talk about here. You know, go back in time again for you. This is Lyndon Johnson's, and you can see that he also starts off pretty high, and that's a high rate of approval. And then he goes down over time. And when he leaves office in 1968, let me see, that's probably around 50%. So, I mean, compared to the past, what you see now is a president with a very low rate of approval. And it's also the case that is not just simply, you know, a Trump phenomena. So let's look at Obama. So here's Obama's approval rating. And what I hope you could see is, yeah, it starts off relatively high, above 60%, then goes down, and then kind of wobbles a bit, generally around 50%. Okay, it's not as flat as Trump's, but it also is flatter than that of previous presidents. So one point here is what is driving presidential approval? And why do some people approve of the president, some people disapprove of the president? And so, you know, if I were here, rather than off where I am, and I ask you, you know, what's going on here, you might say partisanship, and that would be absolutely right. So Democrats tend to think that Democratic presidents are doing a great job, and tend to think Republican presidents are doing a poor job. Republicans tend to think Democratic presidents are doing a poor job, and presidents of their own party are doing a great job. And so that's not the only thing that's driving presidential approval, but it certainly is the most powerful force. So what we also know is that partisanship, as we've talked about, is more powerful today than it was in the past. And so it's really, really hard for a president to win support from members of the opposing party. It's very hard for Trump to convince some Democrats to support him. It was very hard for Obama to convince some Republicans to support him. It's also very hard for Trump to lose some support from Republicans. It was also very hard for Obama to lose some support among Democrats. And what we've seen over time is partisanship playing a more and more powerful role. So in that sense, we see kind of less fluctuation, you know, in presidential approval over time because it's being so powerfully shaped by partisanship. What we also see, you know, is presidents from the past, like Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy, having really high rates of approval, meaning that some of their low points are like 60% of the public supporting them. Now for Obama, his like high points were 50%. He could get nowhere near, you know, the level of approval of those previous presidents. Trump generally has been around 40%. Okay, now there probably is some Trump effect there, maybe some things that are unique about him, let's say, that have resulted in his level of approval dropping quite a bit. But my point is that these days, because of the intensity of partisanship, you're never going to see presidents in the current environment with the high rates of approval that Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy received. It's just much too partisan. There's also fewer people who refer to themselves as political independents in the country today. So it's pretty hard for a president to get those high rates of approval. So that's an important point, and that makes it kind of much more difficult to lead compared to what it had been in the past. Okay, and again, you're not going to see as much kind of volatility over time or presidential approval going up and down over time because of the strength of partisanship. They're gonna maintain support among the members of their own party, and they're not ever going to gain support from members of the opposing party. And so it's just intensely polarized, and that's part of the current environment. Now let us go back and look at a previous president. So here is the chart that I had shown you before on George Bush. It's tough for me to get this lined up because this thing's on a stupid delay. But you can see that upsurge there in the early part of the Bush administration. Now, does anybody know what that upsurge was? So that upsurge was 9/11, okay? So 9/11 happened, an attack on the United States. Over 3,000 people occurred, destruction of Twin Towers in World Trade Center in Washington, D.C., damage to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., I'm sorry, the World Trade Center in New York City, and crashing of the plane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And so, you know, that event happened. Now, not to say he did anything wrong, but George Bush really, at least by the time when that level of approval went up, hadn't done anything except give a speech. Okay, and that was it. The United States had done nothing at that point, but his approval ratings went up. Okay, now probably what was going on there is an outpouring of patriotism, or what scholars refer to and pundits refer to as a rally around the flag effect. And so there was this attack on the United States, and Americans supported their president, who was a symbol as a leader of the country. And so that rally effect leads to a great deal of support. It has nothing to do with actions. Almost any type of foreign policy endeavor where there is military confrontation between the United States and another country leads to an increase in the short term, at least on the outset, of support for the President of the United States. So part of that is, again, probably the public expressing support in terms of patriotism by saying they approve of the job that the president is doing. What also tends to happen in these times where these events occur is there is a quieting of the president's critics. So I mean on a daily basis, you know, you can pick up the newspaper or watch the evening news or go to a website that covers politics, and you'll find these days Democrats making criticisms of Trump. Okay, and during the Obama years, you can go to a website or watch the evening news or read your newspaper, and you'll see Republicans criticizing Obama. And during the George W. Bush years, you can go to any of those media sources, and you'll see the Democrats criticizing George W. Bush. What will happen, though, when we have these events where there is this military, confrontation between the United States and another country, is the president's critics become quiet. And so you'll see a quieting of voices of those elites that generally are out there, criticizing the president and talking about what a terrible job he has been doing. And so there's not that support for criticism there from political elites. So that probably also kind of, helps the president in terms of keeping his level of approval high. Okay? Now, again, you see that September 11th effect there. And you see that other, let me see if I can get this thing here. This other bump up here. Let's see if I can get that there, where President's approval, George W. Bush's approval went up there. And does anybody know what that might be? So what that actually is when Saddam Hussein, the leader, no, actually, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. That's actually when the United States invaded Iraq. That was the beginning of the invasion in March of 2003. And so again, kind of another rally event where the United States began its invasion of Iraq. People thought, the United States needed to do this, or at least, they became convinced that the United States needed to do this. And so there was an outpouring of support for the president. Now, this other kind of bump here, I'm just going to try to show you there. Okay, that one there, that's when Saddam Hussein was captured in Iraq. And so that also increased George W. Bush's level of approval. And so these events out there, and so we could call these kind of, period effects, if you will. Something happens out there and it shapes public opinion. So in this case, they were these foreign policy endeavors, September 11th, the Iraq invasion, and the capture of Saddam Hussein that precipitated these bumps up. But probably then the other kind of story that you see here is that Bush's approval rating is going constantly down, 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 down. And so by the end of the Bush presidency, his approval ratings are a little bit above 30%. And actually, at one point, they get to be around 25% there towards the end, which is really very low for president. That was what Nixon was at about when he resigned. So this other kind of question, is, why does this just go down, 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 down? What is driving it down? Now, we're kind of talking again about those things that are sort of giving it these upticks, but why is it constantly diminishing? And the answers are, well, there's basically two things that are going on that are some of the most important things for influencing presidential approval. One is the Iraq War. So the United States invaded Iraq, and the United States dispatched Iraq very quickly. It was really no contest. The United States uses its superiority in air power and technological superiority to really dismantle quite a bit of Iraq's military forces and really wipe them out. And then even after the United States wiped them out, the ground forces in Iraq were basically nothing. And really, at that point in 2003, Iraq's military capability had been diminished quite a bit by the prior Iraq war in 1991, led by George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush. Okay, and so it really was pretty easy for the United States to go in there and take out Iraq and take down Saddam Hussein. But after the United States won the war, it had a very difficult time maintaining control of the country. And there was an insurgency against the United States. And so at certain points, there were over 100 Americans in Iraq dying per month. And so there was these casualty rates. There were these roadside bombs that would be detonated. They were kind of not, battlefield confrontations between soldiers. If those types of things had occurred, the United States would have won easily. The Iraqi population was kind of indifferent to the United States. There were not many people there who were really supporters of Saddam Hussein, but at the same time, they really had no reason to be very supportive of the United States because they weren't sure what the United States was going to bring to the country there. And so as the casualty rate mounted for the United States, more and more Americans turned against the war and thought it had been a mistake. And basically, again, the costs were being seen for what was at stake. And this was in the reading also that we had by Berinsky. So that was driving it down. Now, what also happened towards the end of the Bush presidency is that the country went into recession and the stock market collapsed. That was caused by a crash in the housing market in the United States. And so the United States went into a very, very severe recession. And that's probably, what also drove George W. Bush's popularity to such a low level that it got as low as 25%. So another important factor for shaping presidential approval is the economy. And that is a very, very, very powerful factor for shaping presidential approval. Whether he can be in charge of it or not, most Americans think that the job of the president is to do a good job on the economy. Now, let me also show you here Bill Clinton's approval ratings over time. And you can see he actually was pretty high, particularly in his second term. He had pretty high levels of approval, and not as much in the beginning. And so what was probably going on there is the economy was just booming from probably about 1994, 95 on until just a little bit. And actually, the boom ended. People didn't realize it, but the boom probably ended at the end of the Clinton presidency, when things started to kind of slow down, but it took a little longer till actually it became evident. And so his approval rating was very, very high because of the economy. Americans hold presidents responsible for the economy. In my mind, they give them more credit than they deserve or give them more blame than they deserve. Recessions and booms are driven by a number of things, some of them events outside of the country, some of them about technological innovations. And so government policy can certainly influence the economy, but in terms of its overall performance, in terms of unemployment and growth in GNP and per capita income, presidents have maybe some control, but not total control. They have a lot more control over the allocation of resources. Let me show you if we can. This period there, this is Reagan's popularity in office, and this upshoot here is when he got shot. And then the downturn is actually a recession referred to as the Reagan recession. And then after the 1983 recession, the U.S. economy began to boom again, and hence his high rate of approval for the most part. Okay. Now you can also see, however, that in this period here, so that is in 1987, roughly in the spring and summer of 1987, there is a drop in Reagan's approval rating. And so a question emerges as to what caused that significant drop. Anybody know the answer to that? Nobody can speak to me. So the reason that we cite for that is the Iran-Contra affair. So there was a scandal. So generally, scandals can be deleterious to a president's popularity. The Iran-Contra scandal was the following. It was found out that there were a group of people working in the Reagan administration who were selling arms to Iranians, to the Iranian government, basically. And in exchange, they got money for those arms, and there was a release of some hostages that had been captured. Now, this turned out to be bad in a number of ways, because one thing then that the Iranians did after being able to buy U.S. arms, military equipment from the United States, and pay for them and get them, though, in exchange for hostages, is they start taking more hostages. So, really, it was a very imprudent policy. And generally, you'll see the United States never negotiates with hostage takers because it just incentivizes them to take more hostages. So that was one bad part of that policy that was widely criticized. The other part was the following. The United States again sold those arms and took the profit from those arms to support who were people referred to as the freedom fighters in Nicaragua, the Contra freedom fighters at that time. That was illegal to do. There had been a bill that was passed by Congress and signed by President Reagan that said that the United States could give no help to these Nicaraguan freedom fighters. So there were a group of people in the Reagan administration that were doing this. Particularly the noteworthy people were Oliver North and John Poindexter. And they said it was clear that they were doing it. Reagan said he didn't know about it. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Clear and Present Danger, it's kind of a little bit of a play on that. It's based on a Tom Clancy novel and has Harrison Ford in it. And it's kind of the story of a president who makes some deals there. But he also tells some aides that what he wants them to do, he cannot tell them. And so he says something like, what I want you to do, I can't tell you to do. So there's this kind of message there that this is what I want you to do, but I can't say you should do it. And so many people believe that actually Reagan knew what was going on, but he kind of kept himself with a cover so he would have deniability. But my point is really there that scandals are bad for a president's popularity, will drive it down. Again, probably the most famous scandal in American politics is Watergate. And so this is Nixon's level of approval in his presidency. And you could see, his approval ratings declining towards the end, and that's because of the Watergate scandal, where there is just story after story after story, week after week after week about what is going on, and then eventually Nixon is forced to resign. Now, so scandals are bad. Probably so you basically now see in the current environment with the Mueller report out and Democrats and Republicans kind of fighting over what it means, with Republicans saying that the president, has been, in the words of the president, exonerated. Some people like the word vindicated, that he's found to have done no wrongdoing. And you see Democrats claiming, there is some wrongdoing here. We don't really have everything from the Mueller report because Barr has redacted some things, and maybe talking about some other things that are kind of problematic, and maybe making a case that maybe there's at least obstruction of justice in their mind committed by President Trump. And so they're trying to use scandal, at least the Democrats are, and Republicans are trying to not let them use scandal. So that's a very powerful force. Another thing that we could see is, I'm going to sort of back up a bit, and I was talking about presidential rises in support due to rally events. And so when we have those events occurring, and there's this outpouring of support for the President of the United States. But as we saw in the case of Iraq, over time, George W. Bush's support went down. And if we were to look at the Korean War for President Truman and the Vietnam War for President Lyndon Johnson and also for President Nixon, you would see that over the course of those wars, the president's popularity started to diminish. And so while those engagements can begin with a high level of public support, generally it does seem to be the case that as they go on, and particularly as the casualty rate mounts in those wars, a president's popularity can start to diminish. So, I think one thing that to see is President Trump, trying to get the United States out of the Mideast, saying, ISIS is defeated and we can withdraw. When President Obama came into office, he was, pretty quick to start pulling the United States out of out of Iraq and try to reduce the United States presence there. And so they all know that if Americans are put in harm's way, it's likely to be the case that it's going to be have negative consequences for their popularity, and then for the number of seats that they hold in office. It can make it more difficult for them to win re-election if they have low rates of approval. So, for example, Harry Truman in 1948 could have run for re-election. He chose not to run for re-election. Now, most people believe that he chose not to run for re-election excuse me, because of his approval ratings had gone down, and he probably wouldn't win. Similarly, Lyndon Johnson in 1968 could have run for re-election, but he chose not to. And probably, again, people believe it was because his popularity had diminished so much due to the Vietnam War that he probably could not win re-election. So that's something. Now, there's some other things that can also influence presidential popularity, or that maybe do influence popularity, albeit in a very, very short term. So presidents can try to affect their popularity in some ways. And I mean, these days, you know, presidents have pollsters, their party conducts focus groups. They are very sophisticated in trying to think about how the president talks to the general public. Presidents will go about the country giving speeches. And so a question kind of emerges as to whether or not these speeches and these events that they do can help their popularity. And at best, it helps very little. And these days, maybe not at all. Presidents' capacity to influence their approval by giving speeches, by giving, you know, State of the Union addresses, excuse me, or other addresses to the general public are very, 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 very limited. Because most people don't pay enough attention, and it's a very partisan environment. So it's very, very tough for a president these days to convince members of the opposing party to support him. There's very few political independents out there to be won with those activities. So they may try to do that, but most of the time what they're doing is maybe holding on to their supporters. and that's about it. And any type of support that they usually get for those things has a relatively short lifespan. You know, there may be at the time of the State of the Union address, you might see a president's popularity increase a little bit, though even that effect is much, much weaker than it had been previously, because fewer people watch it because of cable and the internet. It's easier now to kind of people to find alternatives for their media entertainment. And so if they don't want to watch the President's State of the Union address, they do not need to watch the President's State of the Union address. Okay, so that's, sorry, what I want to say about presidential approval. Some things have been, one of the kind of more interesting ones and events kind of in recent times of presidential approval that you may have heard about is Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky affair. So, you know, Bill Clinton was pretty popular through most of the pretty much all of his second term and towards the latter stage of his first term in office. And in 1998, in January of 1998, it was found out that, or was alleged that he had been having a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, who had been an intern in the White House. And, you know, so at first Clinton denied it, and later on he admitted it. Eventually, there was conclusive evidence, you know, with a number of people testifying that it had occurred. Probably hardly anybody believed that it was appropriate behavior. But what was kind of interesting is that Clinton's popularity actually, when the scandal was revealed, increased. And so it did not have the effect on his popularity that Watergate had on Nixon's or Iran-Contra had on Ronald Reagan's popularity. It actually went up a couple points, not a lot, but 5 or 6 points maybe when the allegations of the scandal were revealed. And so this was really kind of puzzling to a lot of people. And probably the way that political scientists interpret it is the following. Then on the one hand, what Americans probably thought was, well, this is kind of more personal than it is political, and so it's maybe something that they don't like, but it really has no negative impact on the state of the country. And so I think Americans were bothered by it. I think actually it contributed to Al Gore's defeat in the 2000 presidential election, that enough Americans were upset about it and didn't like it, that they were unwilling to support Al Gore. So it did have some negative consequences for the Democrats at that point, but not for Clinton, okay? Certainly it's also had some consequences, I think, for Hillary Clinton, in that when there were allegations made of inappropriate behavior by Donald Trump, he sort of then kind of trotted out, the allegations against Bill Clinton to say, well, he did it, so he did these things as if, one bad makes another bad okay. But also what we kind of think is that Americans started to think about, well, okay, he did this stuff, or it seems as if he may have done this stuff that I find inappropriate, but how was the overall job? And what they thought it was, well, the overall job was really pretty good. And the American economy was just absolutely booming at that time. There were no serious foreign policy conflicts. Welfare rolls were diminishing. Crime was diminishing. So by a lot of measures of the state of the country, things were really pretty good. And so it maybe made Americans take stock of that and resulted in an increase in support for Bill Clinton at that particular point in time. And so that was kind of an unusual event, and something that, we kind of want to, I don't want to necessarily see happen again, but something that happened in the past that was pretty significant. I hope you can always hear me. The mic is up there, and they've kind of knocked a little bit of the ceiling out in order to have the mic come down, which is kind of interesting. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is trust in government. And this has been something that has been surveyed also for a long period of time. And trust in government, I would say, is important for a number of reasons. There are probably, in my mind, two dimensions to trust in government. On the one hand, we could think of the extent we trust government officials in terms of their competence to do the right things, meaning to make good decisions, to use military force in an appropriate way, to not use it when it's going to not be beneficial to the United States, to use it when it is going to be beneficial to the United States, to make sure the government runs effectively, efficiently, to have wise use of our tax dollars. So, probably most people have some kind of notions of what they want the government to do, provide a certain level of security, a certain level of economic growth. And again, that security can be physical security in terms of not being invaded by another nation, or making sure American military resources are used wisely. It can also refer to just a simple level of crime in society, and those aspects. So that's kind of a competency in terms of trust, that you trust someone, the government, to behave competently. Another element of trust, of course, can be moral or ethical. And to the extent that people trust politicians to be honest, to not engage in scandal, to not kind of, enrich themselves while they are in office, and to have some ethical standards there. So scholars have been tracking trust in government over a period of time. Now, trust in government, I would say, is important for the following reasons. On the one hand, we give things to the government. We kind of have to give some things to the government. The government has an ultimate power of coercion. So the government can put us in jail. The government, if we don't follow certain laws, the government can put us in jail. The government can fine us. The government extracts resources from society. It extracts our tax dollars from us. So we have to pay a certain amount of tax to the government to, help for the provision of the roads and schools and parks and medical research and implementation of safety standards and in cars and planes and trains, keeping our borders safe, making sure food is safe, making sure the drugs we might purchase at the pharmacy are safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we give this to the government, our tax dollars. Now, to the extent Americans believe maybe that the government can't be trusted, they may be less willing to give taxes, pay their taxes to the government. We also can be, coerced by the government. We have to follow the government's laws. And probably we're willing to follow those laws more if we believe the government is behaving appropriately and competently and can be trusted. To the extent maybe we don't, maybe people are less willing to follow those laws. We also can give our lives, to the government. So in the event of a war, the government can draft people to be in the military and can coerce them to give their life, can coerce them to enter the military, to go to another country, to fight in that country, to die in that country, come back wounded from that country. And to the extent Americans maybe don't trust the government, maybe they are less willing to do those things. So the next thing I want to do is show you changes in Americans' trust in government, if I can find that. Okay, and let me see, I'm going to show this. Okay, this goes over a long period of time. I hope when I move up you can still hear me, and I can see also the lights kind of dim a little bit. And let me see how close I can get this there, and see if I can line it up or keep on struggling with that. Part of the problem here is the delay. Okay, I'm going to hope that you can see that. So the orangish line to the top, that's high in 1952, is the proportion of the public that disagrees when asked whether or not public officials don't care about what people think. And so in the 1950s, over 60% of the public was really pretty trusting of the government and thought it was, did care what people think. And there really was a minority, probably, like 24% or something like that, that thought that the government did not care about what people think, okay? And then when we went into the 1960s, if you can see this here blue line would in essence represent the amount of distrust goes up, and this other line representing trust basically goes down. And you can see that it changes. And that change really begins in the early 1960s and then accelerates. And for the most part, except for a period in 1984 and a period around 2001, September, you see Americans generally are almost always less trusting compared to what they had been previously. And so we see variation over time in trust in government. I don't have here now with me individual level data, but we've also been interested in to what extent Americans among themselves vary in terms of the amount of trust that they have in government. And again, kind of going with one of the things we've talked about in several cases, one of the things that seems to be driving trust in government is partisanship. So what you see now is Republicans being more trusting than our Democrats. And what you saw 4 years ago is Democrats being more trusting than Republicans. So there is that partisan element to it, that when we have a Republican president, Republicans are more trusting and Democrats less trusting. And when we have a Democrat president, Democrats are more trusting, Republicans less trusting. But we want to talk about why that level of trust in government has changed over time. It's remarkable to me that it was as high as it was in the 1950s. There's other measures, of trust in government going back to 1952, 1954, that show really, really high levels of American trust in government at that time. And I mean levels that it's just one of those things that I kind of look at and think, wow, because it's totally inconceivable to me that we would, get close to that level of trust in government again. Now, I'm not sure what the right level of trust in government is. I think that there is, of course, reason to be skeptical of government, and perhaps, maybe there's reason to be skeptical of everything. No person is perfect. Probably no thing, no element, no institution in society is perfect. So a little bit of distrust is maybe normal and appropriate. At the same time, I also think that perhaps this trust can go too far. And there is in my mind, a thing, one can be too cynical about people or other institutions in American society and what their value is in our society. So, I'll tell you, in my mind, the levels of trust are too low and have been too low. And I do think, in my mind, that government is capable of more than people give it credit for. But that's a personal judgment. Certainly levels of trust also have consequences for how well government functions. So we want to talk about why trust has changed, why trust has diminished in American society, why Americans are less trusting of the government than they used to be. And so these are kind of things that are commonly cited. Well, you can see trust in government going down in the 1960s, and in the 1960s a number of American institutions were under attack. In the 1960s, of course, the Vietnam War began, and the Vietnam War started off not really very dramatically, unlike a number of other wars, but it did begin with a high level of support, and that support started to drop. And so for many Americans, they started to be disillusioned with the war, and probably by 1968, many Americans had become disillusioned with the war. In 1968, 14,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War, so a substantial number. Lyndon Johnson, the president at that time, was generally telling the public that the war was going well, that it was winnable, that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, as he would sometimes say, and military leaders were often also talking about the war in very positive terms. In 1968, when the Viet Cong, who were kind of the insurgency in South Vietnam, the nation that the United States was supporting, launched what was referred to as the Tet Offensive in conjunction with the North Vietnamese. The United States, for at least a brief period, suffered some losses to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. And again, in 1968, 14,000 Americans died in Vietnam. And so to many Americans, the war did not seem winnable, and public opinion started to turn against it. The war started to become extremely divisive, as I assume you all know, with lots of demonstrations, mostly by young people, a lot of them by college students. I'm told here in Geneseo, I'm told at Geneseo there were laws in the state that actually made it such that if you were to participate and protest against the Vietnam War, you could actually be kicked out of school at that time. I should have maybe talked about that when we were talking about political tolerance, but that was something that did occur at that particular time. And so though, the war was, in the minds of most people, in the minds of myself, pretty much a disaster. Over 60,000 Americans were killed, billions and billions and billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars spent, really to no avail. By 1975, the United States just kind of gets out of the war and South Vietnam collapses. And so that probably brought about a drop in support for the government, because Americans saw the government as not behaving competently, as not behaving effectively, and in fact leaders as maybe deceiving them about the war. Then also, beginning in 1973 and then carrying through to the middle of 1974 was the Watergate scandal. And Watergate scandal actually began in the summer of 1972, when a group of guys were caught in the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate building in D.C., and they had been trying to bug the Democratic headquarters to get information on what the Democrats were doing at that time. This was actually, I wouldn't say widely reported, maybe sort of a story in newspapers on the bottom of the front page, but not much follow-up, and nobody believed, most people thought this was just sort of some renegade group of Republicans that had gone rogue and were out there operating on their own. But as time went on, you know, there were more and more stories that came out about the involvement of people in the Nixon administration in Watergate. Many people was found to have committed crimes in the cover-up or did a number of other crimes. The Attorney General, John Mitchell, was convicted of crime and went to jail. A number of other Nixon top advisor, his chief of staff, his top domestic advisor, I mean, people who were like the closest people to him were found to have committed crimes and went to jail. And then eventually Nixon was found to have known at least a couple days after the Watergate burglary that some of his top aides were involved with it, and then had lied about it. And so it was presumed that in that sense what he had done is obstruction of justice. And again, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about in the current context, because when people look at Trump and what he had done with Comey and a number of other ways, people consider that obstruction of justice, that he was trying to prevent an investigation. And so the law is actually, if you know a crime is being committed, you have to report that. Now, he might say again that that was not his intent. So part of the problem sometimes can be that what was the intent. He said a couple things, though, that probably seemed to tip the hat that he was trying to stop the investigation. I mean, I think that's kind of a no-brainer. In some cases, I guess he's been relieved of responsibility because a number of his aides didn't follow his orders. But anyway, the Watergate scandal probably severely diminished American support for government. And again, it was in a scandal where there was, over time, just, you know, constant stories. So it wasn't a story for a week or a month. It was a story for over a year. And so that had deleterious effects on Americans' trust in government. Now, we still see really low levels of trust in government. Okay, so Watergate, you know, ended in 1974. So, you know, that's a long time ago now. That's around 50 years ago now. And so it's really hard to argue, I think, that, you know, we currently have low levels of trust in government. And relative to what we had in the past, we do have low levels of trust in government. But it can't be because of Watergate or Vietnam. Those events are in the distant past. But, you know, if you look at Americans' trust in government, it still is very low. And it is much lower than what it was in the 1950s. So, you know, while those events, Watergate and Vietnam, explain the drop in that particular point in time, I don't think it can explain where we're at now with low levels of trust in government. And really, since the 1970s, we've had low levels of trust in government. So I think what has happened is we have a media that is fairly negative about politicians, and that's also been documented. So, for example, news stories about politicians, there are actually people who code news stories about politicians, and you can find that they're much more negative than they used to be. You can look at surveys of people's evaluations of politicians, and the general public evaluates politicians much more negatively than they had previously. And so it's fed a steady diet of negative stories about American government, American politics, American politicians. Well, you get a fairly negative public about government and politicians and politics. Now, again, I'm not sure what the right level of trust is, and I'm sure there certainly are reasons to have at least some cynicism about government, politics, and politicians, and sort of a blind faith in the competence and ethics of government, politics, and politicians would seem to me to be pretty foolish. I think there can be a healthy skepticism that people might have. At the same time, you know, I don't think everybody in government is incompetent. I think government has done things to improve American society. So, for example, I'm speaking today, actually giving this here little talk on April 22nd. It is Earth Day, and really the American environment, you know, has improved in terms of the cleanliness of air and water. Has gotten better over time. The government made it better with new laws designed to protect the environment. And so I think race relations are problematic in the United States, but are better than what they used to be. And, you know, there still are some things I think that are both bad, and actually I think there's also some areas where things have gotten worse. But, I mean, auto safety is better than it used to be, so government can do some things well and has done some things to improve American society. But I think, as we've talked about when we talked about the media, there's a focus on the negative. There's a focus on politicians who do things wrong, on political corruption, political scandals, sometimes things that they, maybe make misstatements on, and sometimes again that are perhaps trivial matters, really that have no substantive bearing. But we seem to have a kind of thirst or hunger for bad news and bad information. And again, maybe in some ways that just gets our attention. And again, biologists would argue that we're wired for that. That caveman, cavewoman walking around a couple 10,000 years ago or so, they were wired to recognize danger. That it was more problematic, or they should give more attention to seeing a bear or a lion or a saber-toothed tiger, in the woods rather than a tree with apples on it. And so that's actually beneficial to our own survival. But it does seem to me, again, that we give greater weight to negative information, and the media supplies us with a lot of negative information. And unfortunately, a consequence of all that negative information is negativity towards government, politics, and politicians. And there's very, very, very low levels of trust. I think it's very hard to be a leader for the country these days because of the negativity that people have. So, I don't really believe that actually politicians are any worse as people than they used to be. Maybe not any better, but not any worse. But public's negativity towards them is considerably lower than it had been previously. So that's kind of my sort of take on why our levels of trust these days are so low. A couple other ways that low levels of trust have consequences. One I just mentioned, that it's very difficult to be a leader if people are fairly are very cynical about you. So it's a pretty tough job. It's gotten very partisan, so maybe good to be a leader of your own party, but very tough to get support from people of the opposing party, and even tougher when people are very cynical about politics and politicians. As maybe I've kind of hinted at a bit, I think distrust of government is more problematic for liberals. Because liberals believe generally that government can do some things to make society better. And so and conservatives are usually much more cynical about that proposition. So to the extent, trust has gone down, it supports a conservative Republican argument and is in opposition to a Democratic argument that government can do things to make society better. Low levels of trust are also beneficial for, or provide conditions that allow for the rising of a third-party movement. So we don't really have third-party movements arising in our very contemporary period. We did have some arising in the 1990s. Ross Perot making a run in 1992 and 1996. In 1992, he got almost 19% of the vote. In 1996, he got around 6-7% of the vote. And then in 2000, there were a couple third-party candidates, Patrick Buchanan and the car guy whose name escapes me right now. They got small shares of the vote. But usually in those environments, those times when there's a lot of distrust of government, it usually helps third-party movements, and they can become much more popular because they kind of are anti-establishment and anti-government. So I need to check my notes a second here to see what else I want to say on trust in government. And let me kind of close by talking about a couple of institutions in American society that have not lost trust, but also some that do have lost trust. So an institution that still has very high levels of trust is the United States military. So their level of trust is high. And I'm not sure I really would say, or I think it would be fair to say, or honest to say, that the military in the United States performs more competently or ethically than other institutions in American society. And so probably what is going on there is some support and a belief that military folks protect us and potentially could make the ultimate sacrifice. And so there is support that results from that rather than support being actually based upon their level of performance. Trust in the American media has plummeted over the past couple of years, and probably, again, that's maybe best exemplified by President Trump's attacks on the media. And so, anything that usually is critical of him, he refers to as fake news, and generally people say anything that's positive is Fox News that comes to him. But a reason he can kind of attack the media, and some other politicians do it, but he certainly has done it quite a bit, and certainly more so than previous presidents. Is he knows that their level of support in the public is very low, and people are generally very critical of the media. Now, again, there's really a huge media out there. I do think some media out there is awful. But basically, I think most of the mainstream publications, ABC, NBC, CBS, the major networks and the major newspapers, I think are fine, and really competent. We probably do have a media these days that is more partisan, but I would not say that about all media. If you recall in the beginning, I had a little website picture that I distributed, and some media is certainly way out there, way to the left or way to the right, and there's some other media that is fairly substantive. So I think kind of there as well that actually there's generally more negativity towards the media than I think is appropriate or that the media deserves. Again, there's a lot of media out there, and so there's thousands of different sources of media. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there.